My name is Reina Castillo. I'm 34 years old, and 11 years ago, at my own grandmother's funeral, my aunt pulled me aside in the hallway outside the reception room and told me, in a voice low enough that only I could hear it, that I had never really been one of them, that my grandmother had done a generous thing taking me in after my mother passed, but that generosity had never been the same thing as belonging, that the Castillo name was something I carried by circumstance, not by right. I was 23 years old, standing in a black dress in a church hallway, 3 hours after burying the only person in that family who had ever made me feel like the name was mine. I did not cry in front of my aunt. I did not respond. I looked at her for a long moment, and then I walked back into the reception room, and I stayed until it was appropriate to leave, and I drove home, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex for 45 minutes, and I made a decision about what the rest of my life was going to look like. That decision, and the 11 years I spent building it out, is what brought my aunt and her children to a conference room in downtown Houston on a Tuesday morning in March, where the only person standing between them and the complete collapse of everything they had built was the woman they once told did not belong. Before I take you fully into that conference room, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe only if this story is already pulling at something in you. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I genuinely love knowing who is listening and where you are. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Not the funeral and not the conference room. The real beginning, which is a house in San Antonio in the early 90s, and a little girl who arrived in it already understanding that the world could take things from you without warning. My mother, Elena Castillo, was the youngest of 3 siblings. She had an older brother named Hector and an older sister named Gloria. Their mother, my grandmother, was a woman named Rosario, who had come from a small town in Coahuila to San Antonio at 19 and had spent the following 4 decades building a life with the specific, unrelenting patience of someone who understood that nothing worth having arrives quickly. My mother was 31 when she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. I was 4 years old. She died when I was 6, and what I remember of her is the kind of memory that lives not in specific scenes, but in sense impressions. The weight of her hand on my hair, the smell of a particular soap, the way she laughed at something on the television and the sound of it filling the apartment we shared. I don't remember enough of her to mourn her with specificity. What I mourn is the shape of the absence she left. My grandmother took me in without discussion. I do not say that to diminish the decision. It was not a small one. She was 61 years old and already raising 2 of Gloria's children part-time, while Gloria's marriage was in one of its recurring states of crisis. She had her own health concerns, a house that needed constant maintenance, and a fixed income from my grandfather's pension, and her own years of work as a school cafeteria administrator. Taking in a 6-year-old grandchild with no additional resources was not nothing. I have never pretended it was nothing. But Rosario did it the way she did most things. Quietly, completely, without making you feel that you owed her for it. She enrolled me in school. She bought me new shoes when my old ones wore out. She came to every school event with the focused attention of a woman who had decided that presence was the most important thing she could offer. When I was 11 and went through a period of night terrors that I didn't have language for, and that were probably grief finding its way out in the only direction available, she sat outside my room on a wooden chair until I fell back asleep, night after night, without complaint and without explanation. She was not a demonstrative woman. She did not say, "I love you" easily. But she showed up in every concrete way that love actually requires, and I knew what it was. What Rosario could not control was her other children. Hector Castillo, my uncle, was a man who had built a moderately successful plumbing supply business in San Antonio, and who wore that success like a coat that was slightly too large for him, constantly adjusting, constantly aware of it, constantly making sure that everyone nearby was also aware of it. He had a wife named Patricia and 2 sons, Marco and Daniel, who were 5 and 3 years older than me respectively, and who grew up in a house where their father regularly described what the family had built and what it meant and who was responsible for maintaining it. My Aunt Gloria was different in style, but similar in substance. She was warmer on the surface than Hector, laughed more easily, asked more questions, seemed more interested in other people. But underneath the warmth was an accounting, and the accounting kept careful track of who was a Castillo by full right and who was a Castillo by accommodation. I was the latter, and Gloria's warmth toward me always had a slight conditional quality to it, a brightness that could dim when I did something that challenged the arrangement, earned something that one of her children had tried for and not gotten, received more of my grandmother's attention than she, felt the balance sheet warranted, or simply reminded the room, by existing, that my mother had been the sibling nobody talked about anymore. Marco and Daniel, Hector's sons, were not cruel to me, the way children can be cruel with intention and force. They were dismissive, which is a different kind of cruelty and in some ways a harder one to name. I was simply not relevant to the world they moved in. When my grandmother threw birthday parties, they were there because she insisted on family gatherings, but they occupied their own orbit within those gatherings, and I occupied mine, and the two did not intersect more than courtesy required. As we grew older and those orbits solidified, the distance became less noticeable because we had all accepted it as the natural arrangement of things. The message was never delivered in a single speech or a dramatic confrontation. It accumulated in the way Hector described the family business to outsiders, and whose names he included in that description and whose he didn't, in the way Gloria organized family photographs at holiday gatherings and where people were positioned in them, in the way that certain conversations stopped when I entered a room. Not because they were secret in any dramatic sense, but because they were family conversations and there was still some ongoing negotiation inside this family about how far my family membership actually extended. I felt all of it. Children always feel it, even before they have language for what they're feeling. They carry it in the body first and understand it in the mind much later. What my grandmother gave me, in the middle of all of this, was something that none of the rest of them could take away, because it was internal. She taught me to read seriously, which meant she put books in my hands and sat with me while I encountered them and asked me what I thought and then told me what she thought. And those conversations over 15 years were the education I carried into adulthood more than anything I got from a classroom. She told me about my mother carefully, selectively, the way you tell a child about a parent who died young, trying to give them something they can hold without giving them so much it becomes too heavy. She told me that my mother had been the most honest person she had ever known, that she had a gift for seeing things clearly and saying what she saw without cruelty, and that this combination was rarer than most people understood. She told me I had it too. She told me to use it carefully because honest people in dishonest rooms are useful and dangerous in equal measure. I carried those words for years before I fully understood what she meant by them. I left San Antonio at 18 for the University of Texas at Austin on a combination of academic scholarship and financial aid that I had researched and assembled myself, because there had been no one in that house to help me navigate the process, and I had learned early that if I needed something done, I needed to do it myself. My high school counselor had been helpful in a general way, pointing me toward resources, but the actual work, the applications, the financial aid forms, the scholarship essays that required me to articulate who I was and what I intended I did alone, late at night at the kitchen table of my grandmother's house after she had gone to bed, with the deliberate and slightly desperate attention of someone who understood that this was the mechanism and there was no other one available. I chose political science initially because it was the most honest answer I could give to the question of what interested me. I was interested in how power moved, how decisions got made and who made them and what gave them authority, how disputes between people who each believed they were right eventually resolved by argument, by evidence, by who had more resources or more patience or more clarity about what they actually wanted. By the time I was halfway through sophomore year, I had added a pre-law track, and by the time I finished my undergraduate degree, I had been accepted into UT's law school on my first application with a scholarship that covered most of the cost. None of this surprised me. I had been working toward it with the specific, uninterrupted focus of someone who understood that there was no version of the future that arrived without being built, and that the building had to be done entirely by the person who needed it. I called my grandmother every Sunday without exception throughout those years. She was the single continuous thread between my present and the part of my past worth keeping. She asked about my classes, my professors, my friends, whether I was eating properly, whether I was sleeping enough. She told me about the garden, about the neighbor's dog that kept getting into her tomatoes, about which of Gloria's children was currently in some kind of situation and what she was quietly doing about it. Our conversations had the texture of genuine life lived in proximity, even across 250 miles, and they were the thing I protected most carefully about my week. Other things could be rescheduled, shifted, let go. Not Sunday calls with Rosario. Those were the fixed point around which everything else arranged itself. When I told her I had gotten into law school, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Elena would have been so proud of you." She said it simply, the way she said true things, without flourish. I held the phone and didn't speak for a few seconds, and then I thanked her, and we talked about something else. And I drove to the library that afternoon and sat at a corral and let myself feel it fully and privately in the way I had learned to do with large emotions. She died the spring of my second year of law school. She had a stroke in the kitchen of the house on a Wednesday morning in April, and the neighbor who checked on her found her 2 hours later. She never regained consciousness. She was 81 years old. She had lived the whole span of her life with the particular quality of attention that most people talk about wanting and very few people actually maintain. I do not grieve her death. I grieve that she's gone, which is different. She lived fully and long and on her own terms. And the grief I carry is purely selfish. The grief of someone who needed her and can no longer reach her. I flew back to San Antonio for the services. That was where I encountered my Aunt Gloria in the hallway outside the reception room, and where she said what she said. I have already told you what she said. I have already told you how I responded. What I want to tell you now is what I decided in that parking lot, in my car. After I drove away, I decided that I was done trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided I did not have one. I had been conducting an invisible campaign for 23 years, attending the gatherings, performing the warmth, maintaining the forms of kinship with people who experienced me as an imposition rather than a member, and I was finished with that campaign. Not in a heated way. Not in the way of someone who makes angry declarations and sends messages and waits to see what comes back. In the quieter way, the way my grandmother made decisions with full clarity about what was being chosen and what was being released. And then with the stillness that comes after a decision has been fully made and doesn't need to keep being re-examined, I would not cut them off entirely. That was not who I was and is not how I operate, but I would stop performing closeness that did not exist. I would stop attending gatherings that were held together by an obligation no one had voluntarily accepted. I would stop managing my ambitions to a size that made the room comfortable. And I would stop softening the account of my life to make it easier for people who had never invested in it to feel like they were part of it. I would build exactly what I was capable of building, and I would build it out in the open, and I would not apologize for the scale of it. And I would see, eventually, what the truth of it produced. That is what I did for 11 years. Here is what that looked like. I graduated from law school and joined a mid-sized firm in Houston, a deliberate choice, not my highest offer, but the offer that gave me the fastest access to the kind of complex civil litigation that I had decided I wanted to specialize in: property disputes, estate conflicts, business partnership dissolutions, the legal territory where money and family and long-held resentments all arrive in the same room, and someone has to navigate the resulting chaos with precision and without sentiment. I was good at it from the beginning, and I understood why. My grandmother had been right. I could see clearly and say what I saw. In a courtroom, or in a deposition, or in a negotiation, that combination is not just useful, it is decisive. I made partner in 7 years, which was 2 years ahead of the firm's standard timeline and was noted as such when the announcement was made. I had built a specialty practice in complex estate litigation that 3 separate legal publications had written about in the preceding year. Not because I sought the coverage, but because the cases were genuinely interesting and the outcomes were significant, and legal journalists who cover that territory pay attention to patterns when they appear consistently enough. I had a small team of associates who I trained carefully and who stayed with me at rates that the firm's management noted as unusual for a practice area with the pressure my cases carried. I was not an easy person to work for in the sense of being demanding. I was demanding, without apology, but I was fair about it and I was honest, and I told people directly what I saw and what needed changing, which I had found over the years was what most serious people actually wanted from someone above them. They could handle difficult. What they couldn't handle was being left in the dark or managed around. I had been managed around my entire childhood. I did not do it to other people. I had also, in the quieter parts of those years, built a life that was not defined by the absence at its center. I had friends who were real friends, people who had known me through multiple versions of myself and had stayed through the transitions. I had a relationship with a man named Solomon, who was a structural engineer and who had the kind of specific, unhurried intelligence that I had not understood. I was looking for until I was already deep in a conversation with him at a mutual friend's dinner party and realized I had been talking to him for 2 hours and had not noticed the time. We had been together for 4 years. He knew everything about my history, not because I performed it for him, but because he had asked real questions and I had trusted the asking. And I had almost no contact with the Castillo family. A card at Christmas, a brief acknowledgement when births and deaths were announced, the minimum that allowed me to maintain, inside myself, a relationship to the name I legally carried and to the memory of the woman who had given it full meaning. I had not heard from my Uncle Hector directly in 6 years. I had seen my Aunt Gloria once at a cousin's quinceañera that I attended for reasons I still can't fully articulate. Perhaps some remaining wish to see whether time had changed anything, whether the distance had shifted the dynamic enough that I could be in that room without feeling what I always felt in it. It had not. Gloria had hugged me with the specific warmth she reserved for occasions that required warmth, said I looked wonderful, asked a single question about my work that she did not wait for the full answer to, and then moved on to other people. I drove back to Houston that evening and felt the particular tiredness of someone who tested a door they already knew was locked and found it locked again. I had made my peace with it. That is the truest thing I can say, not with satisfaction, not with the clean resolution that certain kinds of stories promise at the end of their difficult passages, but with the actual peace that comes from accepting a reality fully and building something real within its constraints. The family I had been born into did not have a place for me. The family I had built for myself, Solomon, a small set of friends who were closer than siblings, the community of colleagues and mentors who had watched me work and respected what they saw was more than sufficient. I was 33 years old and I was, in every way that mattered, genuinely fine. Then Marco called. Marco Castillo, Hector's older son, my cousin by the arrangement of things, was 40 years old. He had spent his 30s taking over increasing operational responsibility for Hector's plumbing supply business, which had grown from a moderately successful regional operation into something with 4 locations and a distribution arm, and enough complexity that the original simple structure of how the business was held had begun to cause real problems. Hector was 67 and had been dealing with worsening health for 2 years, a cardiac situation that had required surgery, and that had left him less present in the day-to-day than he had ever been in his working life. In his absence, the divisions between Marco and Daniel over how the business should be run had metastasized from a background friction into something actively damaging. I did not know any of this because no one had told me any of this. The call from Marco came on a Tuesday morning in February. I was in my office reviewing deposition transcripts. I looked at the name on my phone and the number attached to it, San Antonio area code, a number I had not seen in years, and I answered with the mild, alert curiosity of someone who does not know what she is about to receive. He said hello. He said my name. He said he was sorry it had been so long. And then, because Marco had always been more direct than his warmth suggested, he said, "We're in trouble, Rena. Real trouble. And I need to ask if you would be willing to help." I did not respond immediately. I set down the deposition transcript. I looked out the window of my office at the Houston skyline, and I gave the moment the full weight it deserved, because what Marco was saying underneath the request was something neither of us was going to name directly on the phone. He was calling me. The one who didn't belong. The one his father had excluded from family conversations for the entirety of her adult life. The one his aunt had told at their grandmother's funeral that the name she carried was a matter of circumstance and not of right. He was calling her and asking for help, which meant the situation was serious enough that the usual social geometry of the family had been overridden by necessity. I asked him to send me an overview of the situation in writing. I told him I would review it and call him back within 48 hours. He thanked me in the particular way of someone who is grateful and uncomfortable with the gratitude simultaneously, and I said it was fine, and I hung up, and I sat with it for a while before I opened anything else. The situation, as Marco's email laid out, and as my follow-up calls over the following week clarified, was a serious legal and structural crisis that had been building for several years and had now arrived at the point where it required immediate skilled intervention, or it was going to cost family a significant portion of what Hector had spent 40 years building. The short version, when Hector had structured his business, he had done so using an arrangement that made sense for the size and complexity of the company at the time, but that had not been updated as the business grew. There were elements of the ownership structure, the way the locations were held, the distribution arm's relationship to the main entity that were creating serious problems now that the business was larger, that multiple family members had varying informal stakes, and that Hector's declining capacity to manage things personally had surfaced questions about succession that the existing structure could not cleanly answer. There was also a specific dispute with the former business partner over the distribution arm, a man who had been brought in 3 years earlier on terms that nobody had properly documented, who now claimed an ownership interest that was significant enough to threaten the entire operation if the dispute went to litigation and he prevailed. This was my specific territory. Complex estate and business litigation, ownership disputes, partnership dissolutions, exactly the category of problem I had spent 7 years building expertise in. The Castillo family did not need a general business attorney. They needed someone who understood the precise intersection of family-held business structure, ownership disputes, and negotiated resolutions. Marco had looked at the landscape and found, apparently, that the most qualified person they could access was the one who had been told she didn't belong. I took a week to think about whether I would help. I want to be honest about that week, because it was not a simple week, and the decision was not a simple one. There was a part of me that wanted to decline. Not out of revenge. I am genuinely not a person who operates from revenge. And if I examine why, I think it's partly because revenge requires you to keep the wound open and tended, which is its own kind of suffering, but from self-protection. These were people who had cost me things. Not material things, nothing I could tally cleanly in a column. The kind of things that cost you something in how you move through the world, in the extra work you have to do internally to believe in your own belonging, in the hours you spend as a young person, sitting with the specific loneliness of feeling like a guest in the only house available to you. Going back into that family's orbit, even in a purely professional capacity, meant choosing to be in proximity to people who had made that cost real. That was not a small thing to weigh, but there was another part of me that my grandmother had raised, the part that could see clearly and say what it saw, and what that part saw was a family in genuine crisis that happened to have a legal and structural problem I was specifically qualified to address. My ability to help them had nothing to do with whether they deserved it. Those are entirely different questions, and I have always kept them in separate rooms in my mind. I have represented people in disputes whose personal conduct was worse than anything my uncle had ever done to me. Because the professional obligation and the personal history are categories I do not allow to contaminate each other. It would have been a failure of everything I had built, every year of work, every carefully developed principle about what kind of lawyer and what kind of person I intended to be, to decline, because the history was painful. So I agreed. And the following Tuesday, I flew to San Antonio. The conference room was at a hotel near the business district rather than at any family member's home or at the company's office, which was a choice Marco had made, and that I appreciated a neutral space, a professional setting, a context that established from the beginning that this was a working meeting rather than a family reunion. I arrived early, as I always do, and I set up my materials and I was reviewing notes when they came in. Hector came in with Marco and Daniel beside him, and he looked older than I had prepared myself for, which I recognized as naive in retrospect. 6 years is a long time, and his health had been difficult, and the man who walked into that conference room with the help of a cane moved nothing like the Gerolling man who had filled every room he entered with the weight of his own importance. He sat down slowly. He looked at me. He said, "Reina." His voice was quieter than I remembered it. Gloria was there with her daughter Simone, who had taken a role in the business 2 years earlier that was more significant than her title reflected. Patricia, Hector's wife, sat beside him. Marco sat across from me with a folder he didn't open. Daniel sat at the end of the table and did not fully meet my eyes. I opened the meeting the way I open every working meeting. I stated the situation as I understood it, the key legal and structural questions, the immediate priorities, and the approach I proposed we take. I was clear and I was specific and I was completely impersonal about it, because impersonal precision is the correct tool for a situation of this complexity, and that was the tool I brought. They listened, all of them, without interruption, which told me more about how frightened they were than anything Marco had said on the phone. The Castillo family, in my experience, interrupted. It was how they processed information. The silence in that room was not the silence of respect, though it may have contained some of that. It was the silence of people who understood that the person speaking had something they needed and that they could not afford to alienate her. When I finished the overview, Hector spoke. He said, "What do you need from us?" I told him exactly what I needed. Documents, timelines, records of the partnership arrangement with the disputed party, communications between family members about the distribution arm going back 3 years, financial statements, the original formation documents for each entity. I told him I needed full access and full honesty, and that the one thing guaranteed to make this situation worse than it already was would be anyone in that room managing what they told me based on how they thought I would react to it. He nodded. He said, "You'll have everything." Then he said something I have not expected. He said it to the table rather than to me directly, in the way that men of his particular generation sometimes say the things that cost them the most sideways, into the middle distance, as if the admission can be released into the room without being fully claimed. He said, "We should have been closer to you all these years. That was a mistake we made. I'm sorry it took something like this to change it." The room was quiet. Gloria looked at the table. Marco looked at me. Daniel had still not fully raised his eyes. I let the silence hold for a moment. Then I said, "I appreciate you saying that." And then I moved back to the work. Because the work was what I could actually do something about, and because I had not come to San Antonio for a reconciliation. I had come to do a job. Whatever else happened would happen at its own pace, in its own way, on terms that I would not negotiate under the pressure of a conference room. The engagement took 4 months. Without going into details that are not mine to share, the dispute with the former partner was resolved through a negotiated settlement that avoided litigation and preserved the distribution arm intact. The ownership structure of the business was reorganized in a way that clarified succession, eliminated the ambiguities that had created the vulnerability in the first place, and gave both Marco and Daniel clearly defined roles with clearly defined authority. It was not simple work, and there were moments inside it that were genuinely difficult, not the legal complexity which I was prepared for, but the family dynamics that surfaced around the edges of the legal work, the old resentments between Marco and Daniel, the way Gloria tried at certain points to shape information in directions that served her daughter Simone's position in the company. The moments when Hector's diminished capacity created gaps that various people rushed to fill with their own interpretations. I navigated all of it, calmly, precisely, without taking sides on the personal dimensions and without allowing the personal dimensions to distort the professional work. I said what I saw, and I did what needed doing, and I went back to Houston at the end of each visit and talked with Solomon about it and slept without difficulty because I had conducted myself in a way I could stand behind. When it was concluded, Marco called me. He thanked me in a way that was longer and more specific than the courtesy required. He said the business would not be what it was without the work I had done. He said the family understood what they owed me, not in the legal fee sense, though that had been properly settled, but in the broader sense. I thanked him. I meant it simply and without weight. My Aunt Gloria called 3 days later. I almost did not answer. I did. She was quiet for a moment after I said hello. The quiet of someone who has prepared something and is checking internally whether they are still willing to say it. Then she said, "I have thought many times about what I said to you at Mama's funeral. I want you to know that I am ashamed of it." She paused. "You didn't deserve that. You have never deserved how we treated you. And the only thing I can say for it is that I was wrong, and I am sorry." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you for calling to say that, Gloria. I know it wasn't easy." And I meant both sentences entirely. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters to say it directly. The point of this story is not that I won. It is not that the family who dismissed me eventually needed me, and that the symmetry of that was satisfying, and that I stood over them in a conference room and let them feel the full weight of what they had lost by not seeing me sooner. That reading of the story is available, and I understand why it might be the first one you reach for, but it is not the true one. The true one is smaller and more difficult than that. The true one is that I spent 11 years building something real, not as a response to them, but as the natural expression of who I was without the distortion of their story about me. My grandmother had handed me the materials, the capacity to see clearly, the habit of honest speech, understanding that belonging is not awarded by others, but built by yourself, and I had used them, and what I built was not a monument to their failure to see me. It was just my life, full and specific and mine. The conference room was not a victory lap. It was a Tuesday morning in March when a family in trouble needed precise professional help, and I was the person qualified to provide it. That I was also the person they had once told did not belong was real, and I will not pretend it had no emotional dimension, but the emotional dimension was not the point. The work was the point. The quality of the work, the precision of it, the fact that I showed up fully and did it completely, that was the point. And the apologies that came after were not the resolution of the story either. An apology at 67, after 40 years of a particular behavior, is not a restoration of what the behavior cost. It is a person arriving late at a truth they should have found sooner. I received it as that, neither more nor less. My relationship with what remains of that family is not repaired, in the sense of being returned to a condition it once had, because there was never a condition to return to. It is being built for the first time, slowly, in the way that things are built when the foundation was missing from the start. Whether it becomes something real, I cannot tell you yet. I am open to it. That is all I can honestly say. What I can tell you is that I do not carry the question anymore. The question of whether I belong in the family that carries my grandmother's name. I stopped carrying it the night I made my decision in the parking lot, and I have not picked it back up since. There have been moments over the 11 years that followed that tried to make me pick it back up. A holiday that passed without contact. A family event I was not informed about until afterward. A piece of news that reached me through a third party because no one thought to tell me directly. Each of those moments had a pull to them. The old question trying to reassert itself, trying to get me to stand in front of a mirror and interrogate what I was and whether it was enough. I learned over time to recognize the pull without following it, to feel it and keep moving. My grandmother settled the question before she died. She settled it in 1,000 small acts over 15 years. The chair she dragged outside my bedroom door in the dark so she could sit with me until I fell back asleep. The conversations about books that went longer than either of us planned. The Sunday calls that never felt like obligation on either end. The phrase "Elena would have been so proud of you," spoken simply and without performance into a phone 250 miles away. She told me what I was. And she was the only person in that family whose definition of me I ever allowed to be the true one. That definition held. It has held through everything that came before the conference room and through everything that came after it. It is holding still. If this story found you tonight, if you are the one in your family who was made to feel like a guest in a house that should have been yours, who built something real and private while people around you debated whether you had the right to build at all, who is still carrying the question of belonging and trying to work out whether it is something others grant you or something you construct through the accumulation of a life lived on honest terms, I want to say something to you directly and without softening it. You do not need a conference room. You do not need a moment where the people who dismissed you are forced by circumstance to look at what you have become and revise their accounting. Those moments are real, and when they arrive, they carry something I will not pretend they don't. But they are not the proof of anything. The proof was never going to be in their recognition. It was always going to be in the doing, in the years of work that accumulated quietly before anyone was watching, in the life you built when no one offered you a foundation and you poured one yourself, in a decision you made wherever and whenever your version of that parking lot moment was to stop giving your energy to people who had decided you were not worth it and to spend every bit of it on the thing you were actually here to make. Your grandmother, or whoever played that role in your life, whoever looked at you with the specific clear attention that sees a person as they actually are and not as the family needs them to be. They were right about you. That is the definition that holds, not the one assembled in rooms where your presence was considered a complication, the one given freely by the person who loved you without keeping score and without conditions. Find that definition if you have lost track of it. Hold it. Let it be the thing you build from, because what you build from that definition is not a monument to anyone's failure. It is not a correction of a record or a proof of a point. It is simply your life, full and specific and entirely yours. And that, I have found, is more than enough to stand on. That is what I did. That is what I am still doing every day in a city that is mine and a life that I built by hand. And I would not trade a single year of the building, even the years that cost the most. Especially those. They were the ones that made the rest of it possible. Thank you for being here with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.